So this is the third video in the series of how to use the business rules, and since the end of the last video I basically redeployed my project, checked my ports, and then I restarted the BizTalk server host. And so now I'm ready to test again. I'm going to get rid of my prior traces here, and then we're going to go to map demo in, and we're going to copy our small test file. Then we're going to go to hat. And remember, by the way, this time when we're running, we've set this value of my environment to the word bad. So now you can see the orchestration actually terminated, and if I scroll over to the right, it says business rules PO trace policy did not fire any rules. And so bad was definitely not a keyword that triggers any of these three rules to fire. And so in the last video what I had done was I set an extra variable here called yes no rules fired. I initialized it to no in the orchestration, and then only by running one of these three rules did the rules fired actually reset back to yes. And so then the orchestration was coded basically to test, and if that rules fired was still equal to no after calling the business rules, we then have a terminate shape here, and that terminate message runs, the whole orchestration stops, and then we have our little message here in hat telling us the orchestration terminated and why. So this is just kind of extra protection when you call business rules. I guess another idea would be actually to have a C# program here where you actually validate that environment is equal to a valid value. Okay, so the whole moral of the story was what happens when you put invalid values here in your configs. Now, the other way you can test your rules is you can actually test them from within this business rule composer. Let me give you a quick demonstration of that, but first we're going to need a test file. So we're going to go to our schemas directory project, and we're going to generate a test file from our PO trace data. So we've done this many times in prior videos. We're going to create an output instance file here called instance1.xml. We're going to right click and say generate instance. We're going to refresh. There's the file. I want to include it in my project. I'm then going to open it, and I'm going to modify it a little bit right here. Okay. So it's a very short file. Almost everything is an attribute, and we have trace on is true. The only thing we really need to pass, the other thing I've done in the past is I've also kind of labeled my variables as request response. I kind of like to think of the business rules as kind of a web service in a way, or a SOA, service-oriented architecture, where basically you pass it parms and you get parms back. So sometimes what I've done is I've actually divided my parms into a request and a response group. In this case, my request is environment, and all the other variables are my response. So I'm going to set the rules fired to no, and I'm going to set this to blank, and actually that's going to be blank or empty, and this is going to be blank. So everything is pretty much set now. So I save that file, and I'm going to go ahead and copy the file name here so I don't have to go searching for it in a few minutes. I'm going to go back to the business rule composer now, and I want to right click on this, and I want to say test policy. So when you test a policy, okay, the screen popped up. This is a list of all the documents all the XML documents or XML messages that this rule needs. And so I'm going to add an instance of that, and this is where I'm going to paste the name of the file that I just created. So here's my test file or my instance file, PO trace instance 1. Okay. Fact creators, you would need one of those if you're calling certain routines, and we'll save that for the advanced course. I do plan to hopefully do an advanced course on the business rule composer, but that'll be an entirely different CD, and that's probably all we'll talk about on that CD. Okay, so we're ready to test. There's a test button at the bottom. We click it, and now you get this output. And this output is, in my opinion, very tricky and hard to read. So what you're going to see at first is a bunch of fact activities, and then you're going to see some tests, and at the end then you'll see actually here if any rules fired, and at the end it actually what it calls is retracts these activities. So here we have two retracts, and at the beginning they're called asserts. So it asserts a fact, and then it says I'm trying to do a test, and I'm looking at the left-hand value test and the right-hand value test. Are they really equal? And the answer is true, because test is equal to test. And so it might also, if you keep going through here, you might see like, does test equal QA? Does test equal prod? So like right here, test is not equal to QA. So that rule was false and it did not fire. Test is not equal to prod, so this rule did not fire. So this is a whole nother way of thinking and programming, basically. Now here's a rule that did fire, and it's called rule name set trace parms test. So that basically helps me to know if my rules are correct before I actually call them from an orchestration. So the point of this is you can actually test your policy to some extent right here inside this utility. And by the way, once you've, every time we do a change to any of our data items, we've talked about how these version numbers go up. And then it's your decision if you want to go back. You can say undeploy, and then once it's in the published state, you can actually delete it. So if you want to delete all your prior versions, you can, or maybe you want to keep a couple backups in there. So that is the policy editor for business rules. Now, one more thing about business rules. If you're going to use them, you have to know how to move them from your test system to your production system. And we'll probably have a module on that, a series of videos in a few minutes that talk about how to migrate entities from one computer to the other. But there is a utility here called the, let me find it, Business Rule Engine Deployment Wizard. And so if you run this, the little wizard pops up, you click Next. The first thing you would do is you would export your policy from your test system. And here you're just telling it your database name. Then here you pick your policy. And this is where you're going to see all the versions. So you noticed a minute ago I deleted version 1.1. So here you'd normally pick your highest version, and then you're going to write this to a file on your disk. So what I'm going to go do is create a little directory over here called deploy. Okay, so I'm going to copy that directory name. I'm going to paste it here in the wizard, and then I'm going to put / and make up a file name. So this is called PO trace policy 1_2 dot, and it is going to be an XML file. I'm going to click Next, and this is the actual syntax of the export command. And you can actually run this from the DOS command prompt if you choose to enter all this text here instead of using the wizard. So it is possible to write scripts to do all this for you. I'm going to click Next. It ran, 0 errors, 0 warnings. And if you want to run the wizard again, you can click that. And then when you click Finish, it basically goes back to the first page and starts all over. So if you have another policy to export, you can just keep doing it. So now in my deploy directory here, this is the file that it wrote out. And again, this is just an intro class, so we really can't go into this in a lot of detail, but you can see your XPath in here to your various variable names. This is very hierarchical. There's the word test that we're comparing to environment. Again, it takes a little bit of time, but you can learn to read this. And you can actually modify this file and re-import it in if you choose to. So like if you misspelled a word, you could come here and do a replace all and then reload it, and that might save you some time in some cases. And then anyway, to take this file from your test system to your production system, then you would basically copy it to your production system, and then you would go back and run the rule wizard again, and then on your production system you would say here import, and then you'd tell it the name of your production database, and then you would browse to the exact same file that you were at a minute ago. You pick your file name, and of course if I try to load it now it's probably going to say duplicate or already exist. So I got one error and it says version 1.2 exists, cannot overlay it basically. And then also on your production system, after you load it or import it, you would then run the wizard again, and you could say deploy the policy. Okay, and I'm not going to run through that, but that just gives you an idea of some of the utilities that are available to work with the business rules. And by the way, the business rules can also be called from C#, and I believe they're more flexible in their license now in BizTalk 2006 than they were in 2004. And another concept that's kind of interesting is that you can actually build your rules on the fly. So instead of building your rules with this utility called the BizTalk or the Microsoft Biz Rule Composer, you can actually code these rules into your C# program, and then you can call classes or whatever that actually build the policy in memory and kind of make it dynamic. So that's a whole nother thought process and a whole nother course on how to do that. So that concludes our 3-part video on the Business Rule Composer and how to use business rules in your orchestration. Just to recap, the main thing we did was, oh, that's fun, nice Chinese letters there. Let me explain this real quick, sorry. When I actually ran the Business Rule Composer, it actually overlays the trace file. So whatever file instance you pass to it, it actually writes it back to disk. Now why it showed the Chinese characters, I'm not sure. It's probably a Unicode type thing. Okay, so here you can see the rules did fire. The answer is yes. The environment was test, the methodology was file, and this is the name of the path. And again, last part of our review is this was the shape we used right here called call rules. And you gave it the name of the policy, and then you pass it the XML message. And by the way, you can also pass it other things like .NET classes and so on. But again, like I said, there's so much you can do with the business rule engine. It's just a whole nother course, basically. So that concludes, again, this video, these 3 videos on the Business Rule Composer.